on the track.
Johnson. And this is Kitchen Table Research, where we do the research so you don't have to. Do we have pictures for this episode?
Nah.
No? Okay. Perfect. So you don't have to go look at any of our photos if you want to listen to this episode, which usually you don't. But we do put together a very great library of pictures and evidence. And I will go ahead and just name our platforms. That way you guys can find us. On Facebook, we are under Kitchen Table Research Podcast. On Instagram, we are at kitchen.table.research. And our Gmail is kitchen.table.research@gmail.com. If you go rate, review, and subscribe, we are now sending bumper stickers that are super cool and have our QR codes on them. And so just take a screenshot and reach out to us through one of our social medias, and we will send you a bumper sticker. Okay, so today Johnson is going to be presenting Polygraphs with us, and we're bringing a new type of series onto our bandwagon of different episodes that we present. So far we've presented deep dives to you guys. That would be like the Austin Yogurt Shop murder and of course the Darley series. And then we do chatters where we talk about updates on crime that is happening currently or updates. Especially, we should be coming at you with Lisk in the future and more Delphi. So that's for chatter. So Johnson, why don't you go ahead and introduce to us what you're presenting us with today and what kind of episode we are going to call these.
So this is the first episode in our table talk series because we have kitchen tables, and
we all sit around a kitchen table all the time, you guys. Don't be fooled.
Yeah, we're definitely not in different states and time zones. Yep, never. So this is going to be like our version of a TED Talk where we dive into the more esoteric and like techniques of law enforcement, myth busting, that kind of thing. So this is really for the diehard fans who want to know more about like the processes and things like police might use. And today we're going to talk about polygraphs because in an upcoming episode, we're going to discuss Darley and Darren Routier taking their polygraph. And I think it's important to really understand the entire process, to really understand how to take those results with a grain of salt.
Okay. So go Polly. It's your birthday.
All right, so we're going to start off with me presenting, and Sully and Jones will make their comments and bust in with questions, a lot like chatters, but this is just for more nerdier content. So we're going to start off with the ancient history of the polygraph. So in ancient China, they would do the rice test, which is they would take some dry rice, stick it in your mouth, and when you spit it out, if the rice was still dry, then they assumed you were lying. And if it came out wet, then you were innocent. And the thought process behind this was people believed that fear and anxiety would lead to decreased salivation and dry mouth. That's not true.
I'm like, isn't it the opposite?
There's no
salivation to lying.
It has nothing to do with lying. Okay. Yeah, there's nothing there. Next time you think your husband's cheating on you, show some rice in his mouth. We'll see.
Exactly.
Another use of the ancient polygraph was in the witch trials, and this is called the ordeal of water. So this is when they would take a suspect, dump them in a body of water, and if you float, you're guilty, and if you drown, you're innocent. Ta-da!
That makes perfect sense.
I know. And the thoughts behind this, and this is a quote, so it signifies that servants of the devil, aka liars, reject baptism, and that's why the water can't accept him or her. Makes perfect sense. Obviously, there's no science behind that. It's not true. So glad we stopped doing that.
You don't think that we should throw Darlie in the lake and see if she sinks or swims?
No. But again, you could put your husband in the bath and just see what happens.
But I'll tell you what this reminds me of is it reminds me of water washing those Guantanamo Bay prisoners where you put them or on TV where they dunk them in the water and you start losing your breath and then you're supposed to tell them everything. So I guess that's where we got that from too.
Yeah, that doesn't sound very reliable either.
I think they're just both torture.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Which torture is a whole nother episode, you guys.
So what? These ancient practices, you can tell that for pretty much all of history, there's this long-held belief we have that the body can indicate deception through like physical signs. And that brings us into the modern history. So we're going to talk about the first polygraph invented. It was invented in the 1920s by psychologist William Moulton Marston. And this guy could have an entire episode on his own. You would not believe how crazy this story is. He's the guy that created Wonder Woman and her lasso of truth. So he has a problem. I think he was betrayed by someone in the past. He's into polyamory, and he had like 2 wives basically living with him, and his wife, his legal one, his first one, actually came up with the first polygraph. She was like, when you make me mad, I think my blood pressure rises. And he took that and ran, and that was literally it. So his wife actually went into the lab with him and helped him develop this polygraph test, which I'm not really sure what that entailed, because as far as I can see, all it involved was Jones, you'll have to help me out with this, sphygmomanometer.
Sphygmomanometer, you got that right.
Sphygmomanometer.
Yes, and that is actually the blood pressure machine.
Okay. So this first one tested the systolic blood pressure, and he never gave his wife any credit at all.
Of course he didn't.
But a big problem with this first one was it was discontinuous reading. So they take your blood pressure at one point, and then they take it again later. So it doesn't really work very well.
Well, we know the more you take your blood pressure, the higher it goes. So,
Oh, does it?
Yeah.
Oh, I guess they got a lot of
High
false
ratings.
positives then.
Yeah, exactly.
They were probably like, oh my gosh, look how well this works. Everyone lies.
It's amazing. We just discovered life itself,
So then we get the modern polygraph, which actually came only a few years after this initial one. So this was around 1923. And this guy also needs an entire episode of his own. His story is amazing as well. He was named John Larson, and he was a cop in Berkeley, California. If you want to know more about this story, he's featured in Kate Winkler Dawson's book, American Sherlock, about some of the first forensics in America, and it is a great read.
Okay.
And it's about like the first guy to invent and take forensics seriously and like create it into a science. And he worked on incredible cases, including like Fatty Arbuckle, a lot of historic ones.
Yeah.
There was this one case he did where he caught a murderer based on handwriting, because he was like, he looked at the note and he realized this is a baker's writing. This is the kind of font you see on cakes. And he caught the guy. It was crazy. The book is amazing.
That's cool.
So the biggest difference with this one is it took a continuous measurement of blood pressure, and they also added in other physiological activity. Do one of you guys want to explain real quick what physiological is?
Physiological means in response to fear, or in response to good, or in response to kindness, or in response to a baby latching on to breastfeed. All those are physiologic responses. Our body does them all by themselves. We don't have to do anything to make those happen. I do want to say, back in the transplant world, we used to attach a blood pressure cuff for 24 hours so that we got continuous readings. And then, of course, we took that and it was mapped out for us so we could see. And you would have to, the patient would have to write, I'm out playing on the playground right now. That no wonder my blood pressure's a little high. So there is really something to be said for continuous readings. Your blood pressure that they take in the doctor's office is one point in time. It does not mean you have high blood pressure if it's high.
I can tell what my blood pressure is when they have the cuff on because I watch, and I can never hear it. And so I learned how to do it by the ticks. And so I'll be like, oh, it's 120 over 80. It's a standard or whatever.
Right.
And they're like, yeah, how do you know that?
Well, I think that you can tell when the blood pressure cuff is on you and it's going.
Right. If you know what to look for, you can feel and count the pulses. Or
you can feel and count it. Exactly.
Yeah. So anyways, okay.
Interesting. So that the blood pressure is actually a physiologic response.
Yes. And it also measures, this is the one we use today. It also measures skin conductance, respiration, and your pulse. So skin conductance, when I first learned about this, I was like, what is skin conductance? And they take the skin they take your skin measurement. Thank you. Because they believe that sweat increases how well our skin conducts electricity. And sweat is thought to be a sign of deception, which, as we'll learn later, is not.
I was going to say, do they control the variables? Like, what if it's just hot or cold in that room? Or what if, like I have an autoimmune disease where my temperature doesn't run baseline?
We'll get to that.
Okay, cool.
Procedures, the steps that they do to administer polygraphs are not standardized. There is a polygraph academy where they teach all their students, the same steps, but you have to pay to go there. It's not guaranteed. So when cops use polygraph administrators, it's no guarantee if you're going to get the same steps as another one or the same methods. There are 4 basic steps to doing the polygraph. Number 1 is establishing a psychological set. So this is pretty similar to when you see cops on TV setting up an interrogation room. They get a box of empty files to look like they have a lot on you. They put you in a small room with bright lights, that kind of thing. It's designed to manipulate your perception and make you feel nervous. And this is also when they develop the questions and review the procedures for this particular case. The second step is called the pre-test interview. And this is where the examiner comes in and they explain the test to you. They give you the instructions, don't move around a lot, don't cross your legs, yada, yada, yada. And they actually review questions they're going to ask you. And then they screen for any health conditions like your autoimmune disease that could interfere with the polygraph. But they do not control things like room temperature, have you eaten, all that kind of stuff. The third step is the stimulation test, and this can be performed either before or during the polygraph. And the point of this is to convince the test taker of the polygraph's validity. An example of this is literally a magic trick, right? They try to trick you into thinking that this is actual science and it's going to work. The examiner will secretly mark a card in a deck of cards and give it to you. And, when they're able to tell if you're lying or not about what card you hold, they're like, oh, look how well this test works. You can't hide anything. And the test taker is like, oh, crap. They take a literal deck of cards like a magician. They secretly mark one or all of them so they can tell if you're lying. So that makes you think that the polygraph works.
Right. Gaslighting. It's like when they gaslight.
Oh.
They tell you something to make you believe it. And once you believe it, then your response is different than it would.
Gaslighting is like the number one manipulation technique among abusers and stuff.
Hot take, magicians are gaslighting us.
Yes, really. Poor Houdini.
This technique is actually pretty effective, and it's something called the bogus pipeline in psychology. So the bogus pipeline is used a lot during social psychology experiments. And what they basically do is they hook you up to a fake polygraph, and they don't do any of this. They just hook you up to a machine. They're like, all right, this is a polygraph. And people are more likely to respond truthfully to emotional and effective questions. And they usually use this when they're trying to reduce false answers in self-report data, which is, like surveys, anything that is based on your own answers. So basically, bogus pipeline is just people are more likely to admit things if they believe that the lie detector works, even if the machine is fake and like a cardboard cutout.
Right.
So it's like placebo. It's like a placebo drug in a way.
Exactly.
I love all the like terms that these psychologists come up with, like placebo and bogus pipeline, and
You'll find more in this episode.
I know. I just love some of the, I mean, obviously all of us have been to psych school in one way or another.
Psych school.
Psych school.
All right. Number 4, step 4. This is just after the test, and it's called the post-test step. And they just they give you a chance to clarify any of your responses. And sometimes, like right then and there, they'll take a general look and be like, well, you're probably lying or you're probably not. And then they go back and study the results, make a conclusion, score your test, whatever. All right. So why do we care about these procedures? I'm glad you asked. These steps really show us these procedures, even though they're not standardized, that the polygraph relies very heavily on interrogation techniques, not science. The entire point of the polygraph is just to make you think that they can tell if you're lying.
Okay, well, I have a question. So are we going to get
go
to
ahead.
like, say that you've been picked up for murder, like Darlie, and they want you to take a polygraph and you refuse. It's almost like, are you going to talk about that?
No.
Okay, so what I mean is like, if they refuse to take it, I feel like then the police, now have a narrative of, they
that's
declined.
exactly what happens. They're guilty.
Right, they're guilty because they declined to take a polygraph test.
They must have something to hide.
And then are you going to talk about like the myths about like how people try and cheat them?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
They're called countermeasures. But up next, we have the method of questions that they use. And there are a bunch of them, but there are 3 main ones that they usually use. So the first one is called CQT, or the comparison question test. And this is used to establish a baseline by asking questions. This is when you see them being like, have you ever betrayed someone? Have you ever broken the law? Things like that. They're very vague, and they're just designed to make you feel nervous so that they can compare it to relevant questions later on and be like, oh, they were nervous here. We know that's how it looks when they're nervous.
Well, and it's
this is when we ask them the question.
Who hasn't like broken the law? Even just like rolling through a stop sign.
Yeah. And it's also obviously problematic. I mean, A, the ambiguity of the questions, and B,
right.
Nervousness is not an indicator of deception.
Because again, I feel like it's another variable where what do I consider breaking the law and what is somebody else? Like, do you mean just, like I rolled through a stop sign, or are you talking about like more like a violent legal situation?
And we also, if a cop's asking you, have you ever broken the law, or the administrator, you're obviously going to be nervous, even if you're innocent.
Right.
So it doesn't make a baseline really, and they really don't use this one very much anymore. The next one is called the relevant-irrelevant test, and this is probably the one most people are familiar with. The purpose is that they assume you're going to have a significantly greater reaction to a relevant question about the crime than an irrelevant question. So this is when you see them being like, what's your name? What day is it? Irrelevant. Did you kill this guy? They assume your nervousness is going to spike.
Okay.
And then we have the concealed information test. So this is mostly useful for when you're trying to see if someone who confessed is being truthful about their confession, because they think your reactions to information that only the guilty know. So like if they're like, did you strangle this person? And if you react when, you haven't released to the media that the victim was strangled, then they kind of know that you're guilty. Does that make sense? So now we're going to talk about polygraph and some laws. So the first one up is the Employee Polygraph Protection Act of 1980. And this was just so employers can't use polygraphs to evaluate employees. Like, someone accuses you of stealing paper clips, they can't hook you up to a polygraph.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And remember, this was invented in the 20s, so employers were probably doing this up until the 80s.
Oh my God.
I worked for a furniture store in Plainview, and this was part of what he did is he made us go take polygraphs because he thought we were stealing from him.
Oh my gosh, really?
Yeah, and that would have been, I graduated in 72. That probably would have been in 75.
Oh my gosh.
Oh my gosh. So at the end of this, I want to hear your story.
Did you fail?
No. Well, nobody ever told us what we did. And nobody got fired, and nobody got a raise. So we don't know what happened.
Oh my God.
They used the bogus pipeline is what happened, probably.
Yeah. I mean,
it was just...
it was to scare us to death.
Yeah. And I'm guessing a lot of you guys on the floor were young, like selling furniture and stuff.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And we had a lot of home decor items that would have been easy to pocket, or if you were working late one night, it'd be real easy to take something out to your car, or,
They walk in the next day, there's like, where's our couch?
It's under
Polygraph.
her shirt as she walks out.
Polygraph.
So the only problem with this law is it does not apply to the government and armed forces.
Oh, hell.
Pentagon and the armed forces use it quite regularly for like spy and terrorist screenings. My husband has been through a few of these in his, trying to get clearance and stuff.
Yeah,
and
I was going to say,
crazy.
I know my husband had to take one when he was in the military for clearance.
Yeah.
That's crazy that they use basically it reminds
bullshit.
me, like bullshit for you to get like
to see if you're selling state secrets.
Yeah, or to be able to have access to like some of the highest information in our government.
The guy that just died, Robert Hardin, something like that. He was an FBI agent, but he had been convicted of spying. And so I guess they got him on a polygraph.
Oh,
isn't that weird? And that Robert Hansen, who lied, I think that I've seen that movie. I think they did get him on a polygraph lie.
I think that was a plot line in Criminal Minds, actually.
Well, it may have been, but there was.
I'm like, are you talking about The Fugitive?
Well, the Fugitive's a real story too.
Yeah, I know. Okay, moving on.
Well, they started the government and the armed forces. The polygraph use became widespread in around 2007. So I think 9/11 had a lot to do with it.
Of course, it did. Yeah.
Because it's we'll talk about it later more, but it really the issues it presents in violating the civil liberties of the employees, even though, government employees are considered property, is, I think they use the Patriot Act to really squeeze it in there and be like, who cares? Do you want to be safe?
Yeah.
Well, and like, obviously I'm not doing well today either.
It's the weekend.
So do the people that are like, say you're somebody that works for the military and you oversee kind of the polygraphs department, do you think these people know that the polygraph is complete bullshit? And
no.
So we really are allowing clearances and things into our military on this subjective test, basically.
Yeah, I mean, from my research, if you're a polygraph administrator, you're only in there because you think they work, Like, I find it hard to believe that you go into that job being like, I'm putting people away and getting them fired over bullshit.
Right. And I'm sure in school they teach you, like, oh, yeah, there's been studies done on this, showing this, and... But have
and there
there,
have been.
I was going to say, have
The
there
issue
been...
is there's issues with all of their studies, and we're going
Right,
to talk
okay.
about those issues later too.
Okay.
They're also used, I'm not sure if they still are, but at least in the past, like 10, 20 years, they were widespread use in probation programs for sex offenders. And they used them to see if these sex offenders were going to offend again.
Oh my God. I hate our
And based
legal
on the
system.
results, they would let them out. Yeah.
Oh God.
Yeah.
And that must be how we figured out that you can't, that recidivism in pedophilia is huge.
More like they let them out and were like, oh, we made a mistake.
We made a mistake.
Yeah.
I just read something yesterday. Ooh, I have to think about where I read it. That they have been doing studies on the serial killers who are still in prison and or even out of prison about whether they're redeemable, because like BTK, there was years between some of his attacks.
Yeah,
and the
with a lot of these guys.
And same with with James D'Angelo killer.
And
so
new list case.
That tells me that serial killers are not as tied to their...
It's not a compulsion.
It's not a compulsion, and pedophilia seems more like a compulsion to me.
I feel like it seems that way, but I don't think it is.
Okay,
because if there was a cop standing there, they wouldn't do it.
True. So there is something that stops them.
Right. You are obviously in control if you know, if I'm going to get caught, I'm not going to do it.
That's an amazing deterrent, isn't it?
I've read Reddits. An individual will have thoughts about sexualizing children, and they do go to therapy before they ever act on it. And so I think if you never act on it and you address the issue, especially obviously the earlier on in life, but I think once you kind of start doing it, then it's almost like you can't go back.
It's almost like a compulsion.
Yeah, and again, I hate to use that word compulsion because of the statement Johnson just made,
urge.
But it's an urge. There you go, because it's
I feel like it's kind of like alcoholics.
Right.
That makes sense.
Like, it might be super hard to control yourself, but you are capable.
Right. I mean, most people go through steps of not drinking.
Unless you've got a lot of comorbid diagnoses.
Yeah, it's a hard thing.
Yeah.
It's very
a hard
complicated.
thing.
Well, why don't we take a polygraph on it?
Okay.
All right. So, why do we care about these laws and uses of the polygraph? Well, I'm going to tell you. Thank you so much for asking. I just want to give a quick shout out to Last Podcast on the Left, because I love when Ben asks the questions that he's told to ask. It's so funny.
Okay. Well, okay then. If you can't tell, me and Johnson are big Last Podcast fans, so.
Yeah. And I haven't listened yet. I will someday.
No,
I have not yet.
We have listened to them.
I don't think you would like it.
We have listened to them, and you go, are those the guys that talk about Satan and scream at each other? Yes.
Yes.
About what?
Are those the guys that talk about Satan and just scream at each other? And I'm like, yes, that would be them.
That's them. Issue number 1 with these is it creates a false sense of security. Polygraphs, as I'm going to go on to show you, do not work. They're not based in science. And we're using them to see if we have terrorists and spies in their midst. And everyone's like, oh, I feel so safe. You're not. It's a false sense of security, and that leads to sloppy mistakes.
Wow, that's
Issue
a heavy
number
statement.
2. Thank you. I'm very passionate about the polygraph. I think it should be outlawed.
Illegal, yeah.
Issue number 2. It's a waste of public resources because, again, we're paying these polygraph examiners. Employees are missing out on paid time to take these. You have to invest in the setup and the machinery, although I'm not sure if police departments have their own or examiners do. But either way, it's a waste of money, and it's a waste of the public's time.
And that's another huge variable. It's like if you're using different police stations' polygraph kits.
Yeah, there's no standardization
and
across any of this.
Blatant, though.
Issue number 3. It's inevitably going to create an unnecessary loss of employees because we're going to talk about false positives later. It's a shocking amount, and all of these innocent people are fired or charged with treason, if you're in the Pentagon or Armed Forces, and I bet 90% of these people are innocent, which creates a whole other issue with the public resources. You have legal fees, you have severance, these people might have to go on unemployment. It's a whole snowball.
So
this is going to end up as junk science.
Right.
It is junk science.
Right. But like hindsight's going to be 2020 in the future.
Do you like Mountain Dew? Like they would ask him all these really weird, irrelevant questions that no one knows why. It's very odd. So issue number 4 with this stuff is it's an infringement of our civil liberties. And not only that, but it's without equally compensatory benefits. So like if you're fired based on a polygraph, you're not going to get a severance check. Your reputation is ruined. You can't put anything on your resume. Again, it just creates so many issues.
Huh.
Well, so I almost feel like drug testing is somewhat similar to that.
Absolutely.
I think drug testing, now for certain jobs, obviously, again, I think it's a civil liberty.
We did a lot of studying as to how we were going to treat a positive marijuana result versus in Texas, where it is not legal, versus a positive marijuana report in Colorado, because it is legal. And, we were taught, and who knows, I don't know whether this is true, but the initial teaching was that the level of marijuana is not in relation to the last time you smoked. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's what we were taught. Now, there's been so much misinformation out there.
Yeah. Well, there's factors. It's like, obviously, some people have more body fat. I feel like it takes women longer to get it out of their system because it is like a fat, soluble, which most other drugs are not. And that's why they clear the system so quickly, because they just stay in the blood-brain barrier and then they get released as toxins.
All right. So the history of the polygraph and the criminal trials, I'm just going to keep it short here. Fry versus the U.S. 1923. You guys have heard us talk about this a lot, especially in the Darley case, so I'm not really going to go into it because we already have.
Will you just give us like a basic breakdown of it, though?
Yeah. So Fry was just like, if it's a new science that hasn't been vetted and isn't generally agreed upon, it's not admissible in court. Can't use it. So because of that ruling, the polygraph really isn't generally used in courts today, although a judge can decide to admit it. Although anything you say during a polygraph is admissible. So the test results are not usually, but anything you say is.
Like, say you confess during your polygraph, then that confession would
admissible.
Be admissible. Okay.
Yeah. Or say, during one of their control questions, they're like, have you ever betrayed someone? And you say yes, the prosecution can then use that to assassinate your character.
Yikes. I don't like that.
So never agree to a polygraph.
I was going to say also, like, obviously the first thing we all know is if you're ever convicted of a crime that you have not committed is to lawyer up. And so can your lawyer basically decline the test for you, or can you have your lawyer in the room with you? How does the lawyer play into like the polygraph, or would a lawyer just tell you not to take it?
I think your lawyer
would tell you not to take it
if they're worth anything.
Yeah.
And if you're going to be charged, why wouldn't you? Why would you take a polygraph if you already know you're going to be charged? Because they'll just use it to add to your guilty verdict.
Yeah, then why would
I feel like a lot of people are very naive and still think, oh, I'm innocent, it will show I'm innocent.
Absolutely.
Right.
So,
but I'm pretty sure your lawyer can refuse for you, but regardless of who refuses, they're still going to say they refuse to take it. Okay, so now we're going to get into the issues with the polygraph. that we haven't talked about yet
Okay.
in depth. Okay, so issue number 1, it relies on physiological activity. So the first problem with relying on physiological activity is there are large individual differences between people's responses. So, like, for example, I have anxiety, and when I'm anxious, which is anytime I'm not in the house, I sweat a lot. So, they're measuring my skin conductance during the polygraph, and they go, she must be guilty. Look how much she's sweating.
She's a
And I'm just
sweater.
like, actually, my examiner's super hot and I'm nervous,
Right.
And vice versa. Some people, even if they're lying, might not sweat because they're lying.
Well, and like I run a weird temperature because of my autoimmune, and I am also like a major sweater. Mom had radiation and it changed her physiological symptoms to where she used to be a sweat ball and now she's freezing all the time.
Yeah,
so like even a
that's
medical
true.
procedure, I feel like she's undergone radiation. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
And here's another issue. Even though they pre-screen you for medical conditions, these examiners are not doctors. They might
Right.
not know that that is relevant to the test and give it to you anyway and say, it affects her results.
right.
All right. So another issue with the physiological activity is it's based on the Pinocchio response. There you go, another buzzword. So the Pinocchio response is the entire basis of the polygraph is that we think there's biological and physiological responses to deception, and there's zero evidence for this whatsoever.
Okay.
And they've
Okay.
done study after study after study, no proof.
Okay.
So the thought would be if I'm lying, my blood pressure goes up or my breathing rate goes up, when in fact that's not true at all.
Yeah, some people do, some people don't. There's no evidence that it's reliable.
Well, I'm
indicator.
also like, if you're a serial killer and you like don't link your emotions to physiological
you're not nervous
responses,
because
you're
you
not
think
nervous.
you're invincible.
Right, exactly.
Well, and if you're a sociopath, you have no empathy, so you absolutely are not going to respond.
Yeah, you
to
can
a
totally
polygraph.
disconnect.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So basically, the polygraph can be a good indicator of nervousness for some people, and that's about it.
Okay.
Issue number 2, there are a lot of different numbers, but the mean, averages are bullshit. We always take the mean here, KTR. There is a 40% rate of false positives.
Wow, okay. That's way too much.
Yeah.
And some people think that your intelligence or your education level lets you avoid detection. So you're like, oh, I'm smart. I know how to beat this. Actually, the majority of false positives occur among people with college degrees. So the more smart you are, the more educated, the more likely you are to have a false positive.
Wow.
And we don't know why.
Wow, that's super interesting.
Yeah, my guess would be where these people are intelligent enough to know they're in big trouble. So they're nervous.
I was going to say,
it's part of that critical thinking kind of stuff. Oh, shit,
Yeah.
I know I'm in trouble. Yeah, I get you.
I don't know, though, because I feel like, lower income, which is a lot of the people that end up in prison, especially like Black low income, is it because, I don't know,
Sure,
like
you
they're
would
not
think they're,
scared of the police, or they are scared of, like, they don't respect the police,
Yeah.
And I don't mean that in like a racial way or whatever, but I just mean that, there's a lot of Black people in our country right now that do not trust our police force.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It could be the expectation of getting fucked over makes you calmer.
Yeah. I mean, or it could just be one of those, like, correlation is not causation,
Yeah, that's also true. So another issue with the polygraph is confirmation bias, and this affects pretty much every single stage of the polygraph. So all of these polygraph examiners, not in Japan, but in the US, most of them are given knowledge about the case, so they know what questions to ask and like write down. But the issue is they already are tainted by this prior knowledge. So if they look at you and they know they're asking about a murder, and they're like, yeah, he looks like a murderer. And that's going to affect their questions, how they ask the questions, how they score and interpret your chart. And there have been studies done on, how effective the polygraph is if the examiner has prior information versus if they don't. And it really affects the rate of false positives.
So it's more false positives if they know the case.
Yes.
What happens if the examiner comes out of, let's say, the examiner has hidden childhood trauma? Is that more likely to affect the polygraph outcome?
There hasn't been a study on that specifically that I found, but you have to imagine it would, because you're like, it's the same thing with juries when they see terrible photos of like children dead.
Right.
They're like, I want someone to pay.
Right.
So you're gonna.
But it's like, what if you're questioning a pedophile and you were molested as a child?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know that, I don't know if this person is guilty for this crime. We're trying to find out, but we know that he was called in because he was convicted previously. That confirmation bias is going to make you give a false positive.
Well, and I just think everybody, whether you've been a victim of trauma or not, I mean, everybody doesn't like a pedophile. No one likes a pedophile.
No,
except pedophiles.
Well, yeah, but you know what I mean? It's just like, if you think they're on the hook for pedophilia, that's almost one of the worst things, I feel like, in our culture that can happen,
Yeah. Now we're going to talk about issues with countermeasures, which Sully, you asked about.
Okay, cool. I'm excited.
Okay, so do you want to tell us which ones you know about?
Okay, so I've heard that, like, the military trains you on how to control some of your physiological responses is one thing I've heard. And then the second thing I've heard is the trick where you, like, put a tack in your foot so that it throws the baseline or whatever. Or you go in there over anxious, or you go in there and say you take a Xanax before you take your polygraph.
Yes. So here's a huge issue. All of those are actual countermeasures.
Yay!
And another one is a psychological one. So if you make yourself believe the lie, you don't get nervous.
Well, and that's what I was saying about serial killers and stuff, is they don't think they're in the wrong. And so, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
Non-physical countermeasures. So, like, you can tell maybe if there's a tack in someone's foot during the exam. But otherwise, you can't tell if someone's doing it during the study. And a lot of polygraph examiners will say, we can always tell, like, if someone is trying to cheat the test. Studies have been done, they can't ever tell, pretty much.
Wow. Okay.
Unless it's like a physical one, they can see, like, you're crossing your legs to affect your blood pressure, or you're going like to affect your respiration.
Right. But again, I just think, going back, almost everyone has some sort of medical thing or another that affects your physiology, even if you have, like, asthma or, I mean, like, most people have something: anxiety, depression, asthma, sweating conditions. Like we said, some people get Botox in their hands and their armpits to prevent sweating. So it's just, that's a huge one for me, is the variable.
So polygraph examiners will defend this by saying, well, we pre-screen to make sure that doesn't happen. But the issue is they have a list of conditions that they will ask you for, but they're not doctors. Like, I bet they would never think to ask, have you had radiation?
Right.
Now we're
and then you're getting into your medical.
Very interesting.
I was going to say, and then you're getting almost into, like, HIPAA laws, where are you allowed, like, how much of my disease do I have to tell you about, and what way it affects me? Because that goes against, again, another huge right of mine, which is our HIPAA laws.
Civil liberty.
Yeah. And HIPAA laws
again
are laws that cover that your medical information cannot be shared.
And once again, anything you say during this about your medical condition is usable in court. So now we're going to talk about the empirical studies that have been done on the polygraph and its validity and efficacy.
And explain to us, like, what's the difference between an empirical study and, like, a peer-reviewed study?
Do you want to go ahead?
No, because I don't know.
Jones, do you know? Yeah. Okay. So I thought you guys knew.
Guess
I'm
not.
sorry.
Okay.
Okay. So empirical studies are based in something you can measure and observe. So they're based in fact
Fact.
that you can see.
That totally
kind of
makes
stuff.
sense.
A peer-reviewed study, all peer review means is people have looked it over and been like, yeah, you're not bullshitting us. So issue number one with the studies that have been done on the polygraph is most studies on the polygraph's effectiveness have been lab-based. So you do it in a lab, not like in a police station.
Right.
And the issue with this is the people that you're giving the polygraphs to record all the different findings, they know there's no consequences
Right.
for failing. So it's a major variable that affects this. So they've also done field studies, which they do go into the police station and observe all of that. The issue with those is you can't judge if the polygraph worked because you don't know the truth. You're there because you don't know who murdered this person or did this crime. So it's
Okay.
hard to say, how do you know if it worked?
Right.
Most of the studies that say polygraphs worked are based on the conviction rates. So like if the polygraph testee
Right.
failed and they get convicted, they're like, oh, it must have worked. But that's obviously false science.
Well, and that's just backward.
Like anything you could come up with to defend the polygraph, they all have issues.
And the jury's already
So
heard
you can
it.
say,
Right.
You've just opened up a can of worms.
Like,
You either exclude
all variables.
all of them or none of the variables.
Right. If you
Yeah.
can, to what degree that you can.
and the issue with all of these studies, any study ever, is you cannot control every variable.
Right.
That's right.
Right. Especially whenever you're looking at the human condition.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk about the issues when we're using it for security purposes. We already mentioned a lot, but a big one is the ambiguous questions that they use. So if you're screening someone for being a spy or a terrorist, what do you ask them? You go, would you ever sell state secrets? You could easily go, well, I wouldn't sell them for money. I would give them away for something else. And then you're not lying.
Right.
Yeah.
And another issue is, again, you cannot quantify the objective truth about something you might do in the future. Like, how do you measure that? You can't.
Right.
So we don't
There's
know
no way.
polygraphs really work in this situation because how could we ever tell?
Right.
Right.
And one of my favorite movies is The Minority Report. I don't know if you guys have seen it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Can you
I don't
tell us real
know.
quick what it is?
Okay, so basically, well, it has Tom Cruise in it, and something I was going to say earlier
Yes.
is that it reminds me of the Scientology things. Like
Yes.
I forget what they're called, but they
The-
hold those two metal pieces, and supposedly the needle goes up and down, and you're
They're
being
like,
on
"Woo."
you're being honest when they're crossing or whatever, and and so again,
Which
it's
is like an old occult thing.
right. It's just, again, well, because Hubbard was an occultist, and so it reminds me of those. But at any rate, so Tom Cruise is in it, and it's basically for them to tell the future murders that have not happened yet. And like a ball rolls down this thing, and we find out that there's like, is it one or a couple of like women are like floating in this float tank, and they're hooked up to all these machines, and they're supposed to almost be like a soothsayer, or like you would think about in
Like psychics
Greek,
that they've enslaved.
like exactly, that tell them when somebody's going to be murdered. And as the story shows, doesn't the ball come down and it's him?
But the biggest takeaway from that movie, I think, is it really makes you think, if you know who's going to do a crime in the future, can you arrest them for something they've never done?
Well, and what if between now and the future a variable changes in their life where, like, okay, they were supposed to have custody of their kid that weekend. Well, mom had a bad feeling and didn't take him to the dad's house, and so the dad was never able to commit the crime.
Exactly. And I think a big issue with the polygraph is, again, if you're firing someone based on something they may or may not do in the future, is that ethical?
No, I mean,
No, I don't think so.
So,
Because
yeah.
because I have the ability to change if I choose.
right.
Defenders of the polygraph are going to be like, well, this terrorist said, I would never blow up the Twin Towers and they failed the polygraph, how can you be mad that we find? And I feel like a lot of people agree with that.
Yeah.
I don't. But
Right.
yeah. But that's because we know the polygraph is not
Well, now
good.
I know. Right.
Yeah. All right. So I think this is probably the biggest issue with the polygraph is the heads I win, tails you lose. Another more buzzwords.
I know. I love it. Psychology comes up with all the words.
People think the polygraph is reliable because if an accused person fails the exam and then they admit to doing the crime, then they're like, oh, the polygraph works. If the accused person fails the exam and doesn't admit to anything, then people go, oh, it works because criminals never confess anyway. If you pass the test and you don't admit to anything, because, why would you? Then once again, they're like, oh, it worked. They passed and they didn't admit to anything. So obviously it must be accurate.
Well, obviously they're not guilty.
Yeah. So any way you look at it, people are like, oh, it must work. When, as we know, correlation is not causation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think that's why a lot of people still believe in the polygraph because it's easy to interpret it as working, even though it hasn't.
Well, and I'll be honest, my opinion before this episode, before we kind of started talking about polygraph tests, especially in the Routier case, I thought, okay, I get that it's not like an exact science, but I thought there was something to it to like, well, maybe it will lead us to another, lead or a name will come out of it or something that the police can then use, or like it can point you in a direction. Even though I know there's false positives, I still thought that there was at least some scientific or some backing to this. And so this is actually quite shocking, especially when you start talking about it in the military industrial complex.
I'm so excited I changed your mind because I am so passionate about this, and I'm like, I don't know how anyone could ever.
Well, because people don't know. And why would the police want us to know that?
So that's another reason I wanted to start this Table Talk series is if you ever are in that situation, you know these things and what to do for not your own benefit, but just to make sure you get treated fairly, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Another issue with the false positives is you say, okay, well, it's 40%. That's pretty bad, but it's not like 70%, right? But we just talked about all the issues with the empirical testing and how none of those can be trusted. So that false positive could be much, much higher. And we just can't tell because we don't know when it works and when it doesn't.
People perceive things in such a different way. Like I took a perceptions class when I was in psychology, and the way some people perceive things, like, no, I didn't murder anybody. In their head, they're like, I was in self-defense, so I think I'm in the right.
And a big issue with the polygraph is the perception. The whole thing is set up to manipulate your perceptions and make you say something you don't mean. Or if you're honest, you see that the thing says you're lying. So then you second guess yourself and go, did I black out? Do I not remember? Am I going crazy?
Right.
And then you admit to something that you never did.
Another thing I feel like, and I don't know if they do this in real life, but like say that, you spike, like, did you kill, your wife, and it spikes. Then the polygraph tester, will then kind of like stand up on the table and be like,
oh, obviously this person's guilty. I'm going to treat them that way.
Right.
So let's talk about the good things about the polygraph.
Oh, okay.
It is actually pretty effective at getting confessions because, again, this whole thing is designed to make you think it works. And if you think it does, then you're probably going to confess because you're like, they're going to know anyway.
So instead of it being used as a standalone polygraph test, it should be thrown into more of interrogation techniques. Right.
But again, only if they're like, we know this is not science. This is just a tool to manipulate someone.
And we already have found DNA that matches, or we found their fingerprint or their footprint there already, and they're driving home a confession.
Yeah. But again, you still have that issue. Like, look at Brendan Dassey.
Right.
He
was not even
treated legally. I'm lying.
legally.
I must be lying. Yeah.
Right.
So
yeah.
you get false confessions there again.
I'll touch on it on the next talk that we do about some other women that have been placed on death row. And I know there's one false confession in there, if not two. So that'll be interesting to tie that back.
Yeah. And again, the studies show that it's good at getting confessions. We don't know how many of those are false confessions. That hasn't been studied.
Right.
So another good thing potentially about the polygraph is it can deter violations. And this is purely theoretical. There haven't been studies done on this. But again, if you think it works, you might be less likely to commit a crime because they're like, oh, they can tell if I'm lying about it.
Yeah.
It also increases the public's confidence in our safety. So especially after 9/11, people are like, oh, thank God they have polygraphs so they can weed out the terrorists. Again, if you think it works, you feel better.
Right. And again, you are not safe out there.
Yeah, never. You're never safe. Never relax.
You are never safe.
So the polygraph, it can be a great placebo if used correctly, but it is just absolutely not science in any way, shape, or form. So we're almost done. And this stuff is kind of extra, so if this runs long, you can cut this out later. But I want to talk about the alternatives to the polygraph and talk about truth serum.
Okay.
You're not as excited as I was to talk about truth serum.
No, I just am like on a timetable. Do you think we'll be done on the hour?
Oh, we'll be done in like 10 minutes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Okay, so what do you guys think about truth serum? What do you know about it?
I do know that there is medications that can be taken that just lower your inhibitions. It's like when people say things when you're drunk that sometimes people spill secrets and they spill the tea when they've been drinking too much. And so I know that they have come up with some formula that kind of works the same way where it just lowers your inhibitions and it makes it harder for you to lie, but it's not like truth serum.
Okay, that's exactly what I was going to say. So good job.
There you go.
Episode over.
Yeah.
No.
But also, in my research, apparently
Frank on the camera looks so funny because he's like halfway and
stop clawing my headset.
It looks like he's coming out of that cave.
Apparently, it's hard. Like if you ask someone in truth serum a question, it's really hard to get a direct answer. So that's the only thing I would add.
Because their inhibitions are so lowered.
And they're just drugged out of their head.
Yeah, like...
And they're like, did you kill this person? My mama used to tell me.
Right. It's like coming home on anesthesia where you just say...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I know that they used it, or I know that they tested it quite extensively when they were doing LSD testing and marijuana testing within, like, the CIA. Do they use that, though, as, like, something that they still use today? Or was that just something they kind of experimented with?
So, as far as I can tell, I did, like, a brief search since this episode really isn't on truth serum specifically. Sure. From what I can tell, police don't, but, like, places like Guantanamo Bay definitely do.
Yeah, okay.
Although that's been shut down now, I think.
I think they use it in Silence of the Lambs, don't they?
I don't remember. I've only seen it once.
I'm pretty sure that they use it on Hannibal Lecter. And he's so smart that, of course, it doesn't, like, affect him. Or he's built a tolerance to it or some bullshit like that. Or I don't know.
Yeah, I don't remember, Anna. I do not. Okay. I do not remember that.
I think it is, but I could be wrong. Anyways, moving on.
Now we're going to do kind of like a Shark Tank moment. Okay? You guys ready? You got your creative juices flowing?
Sure.
Okay.
All right. I don't really think there's a way right now to detect deception with the current technology we have, but I had a couple ideas about how possibly we could do it and develop that tech. What do you guys think? I know it's on the spot, but do you guys have any ideas of a way to tell deception that might actually be effective?
I was going to say, I know that there is some, again, there's still so many variables to account for, but people's body language, the way they move their eyes, people...
I'm so glad you said that.
Okay.
So so I can rip you apart.
I was going to say, but I'm
Well,
now
it's really-
thinking that this is junk science. So,
It absolutely fucking is. At CrimeCon, they still give like lie detection lectures. It's all bullshit.
wow.
All that stuff.
And you know those 4 behavioral guys that are part of the crowd after hours, and they do the behavior thing. They're on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was trying to decide, do I want to go see them? Because in my practice, I could tell. I think I could tell when either a kid and or a parent was lying to me. And that has to be through some of the behavior because I wasn't giving them truth serum.
So,
So
yeah, a lot of people feel that way. And the science says unless you know them very well, you can't tell.
you can't.
Well, and that is one
so your
thing.
gut is useless.
Yeah. So, like crossing your arms, looking to the left instead of the right, shaking your leg up and down, none of that is reliable indicator.
I mean,
Wow.
I cross my arms a lot because I rest them on my fat belly.
I'm trying to hold my boobs up and give my back a break.
Right? I mean, again,
or like get that under boob sweat. Just like tuck them in there.
What
But
polygraphers don't know.
yeah, do they measure the boob sweat in a polygraph?
You know what? I think they actually do.
I think they might.
Because have you seen, at least the way my husband's told me about his exam, they wrap like every inch of your body with this stuff to measure it. And one goes right under your chest line.
Right.
So probably.
Yeah.
Okay. So Jones, do you have any ideas about how we can detect deception scientifically?
What about, this is silly, but what about like reading brainwaves?
Bitch, that was one of my ideas.
Oh, shit. Okay.
And it took me much, much longer to think of that.
Well, I'm just thinking, like, what can you
class.
actually... But again, I mean, it's like everybody's brain works so differently. Like, mapping one person's brain isn't gonna...
Yeah, and also I looked into it, and there's been no studies done on if we can detect deception with brainwaves or if there are specific areas that light up or anything like that. I think it could be an area for future study, but we don't know yet. The behavioral changes you can notice that people think indicates lying. So the science shows that if you actually know someone well, like your husband, you can tell if they're lying because you know their habits. Right. So like, you can't tell just anyone is lying if they look to the left when they lie. But when you have a husband, you know them well enough to be like, he does that every time. Right. Like, I know my husband, every time he's lying to me, he raises his voice. He's like, no, of course I didn't do that. Which, like, doesn't apply to everyone. So my idea was you can build a behavioral profile based on the information of the people closest to your suspect. And, of course, there's a lot of issues with that, but maybe that would be a better way than the polygraph. So you'd have to trust that people will cooperate, their memories are accurate, they are fine cooperating with the police and potentially putting their loved one in jail. But it's, I feel like, better than the polygraph.
So what if you gave them the hair psychopathy test and they scored, is it above a 30 that you're a psychopath?
Yeah.
I mean, that kind of points that.
But if you know that you're being tested for...
It's very easy to lie
on.
Yeah.
Like,
I'm not going to say I'm manipulative because I know manipulation creates a killer. You know, I'm not going to say... I used to cheat all the time on my ADHD tests because I didn't want them giving me... I didn't want to take the medicine. And so I knew what they wanted to hear. And so I just lie on
this would have been so much easier if you had just told the truth. I could have helped you so much more.
Anyways.
And there we go.
And...
Is there anything else you guys wanted to say before I do that?
No, we're happy that you guys joined us for our first table talk. I hope that you guys, this episode turned out fantastic, I think. And I'm going to try and do the Michael Morton episode, drop a Darley episode, and then drop this one. So I have some
And you got-
editing to
you-
do, but I'm also just closed on my house and I'm trying to move. And so if these episodes are delayed by a week or two, I'm very sorry, but they will be out very soon.
By
Anna,
the time
did
this
you
comes
get all
out
the
for you saying
pictures?
that, the other episodes will already
Be out. I know.
Love ya.
All right. Well, we are
okay.
going to CrimeCon. You guys will see us there. We've got episodes coming out. I mean, what more do you want from us?
All right. And now for our sources.
And now for our sources.
The Limits of the Polygraph by David Fagman and others. That's from Issues in Science and Technology. Issues in Science and Technology is a policy journal by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, Medicine. I also took information from the polygraph / lie detector test is an accurate means of detecting dishonesty by Scott Lilienfeld and others, and that's from the book 50 Great Myths of Popular Psychology. I took information from Polygraphs Introduction at Trial, and that's from the DOJ archives in the Criminal Resource Manual. I took information from the validity of polygraph testing, scientific analysis, and public controversy by Leonard Sachs and others. That's from the American Psychologist, which is a peer-reviewed academic journal published by the APA. I took information from Historical Techniques of Lie Detection by Martina Visianova from Europe's Journal of Psychology. And that is a free online peer-reviewed journal publishing original studies, research, contributions, interviews, and books for psychologists.